Well, if you'd open your Bibles, please, to the book of 1 Peter, chapter 1. Once again, I must express my appreciation for the opportunity to preach to you. You are an amazing people. You are the people for whom Christ has died. You are the people that he loves with a special kind of love. And therefore, you are the best kind of people to be with. And since he loves you, it is a continual joy and pleasure to me to be able to once again minister his love and his comfort to you. And that is exactly what I hope to do this morning. If you're not at 1 Peter chapter 1 yet, better hurry because we're about to read the text. 1 Peter chapter 1. Our text for this morning will be verses 6 and 7, but so that you can understand the context, I'm going to read from verses 3 through 9. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to the inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice, though now, for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. This is the word of God. May he apply it to our hearts as it is preached. If you can reach back into the vast recesses of your memory from 7 days ago, you may remember what we talked about last time. We talked about the gospel and the effect that it should have on our lives. And essentially, we asked two questions. The first of those questions was, what is the gospel? If salvation has been offered to us, then how has it been offered to us? And then, if we do believe that gospel, then what should that gospel cause in us? And we summed up the answer to those two questions from Isaiah chapter 12 by stating that salvation produces jubilation, which then propels us into proclamation. When the gospel takes root in our hearts as the people of God, it creates in us a profound joy, which then spills over in our witness to the world. But I don't want to cause you to be naive. Without contradicting anything that I said last week, I don't want to leave you with the impression that gospel witness is all flowers and unicorns. Yes, in our hearts, there springs up a profound joy for the gospel, and that joy then supercharges us to go out into the world and preach that gospel to a dying people. But we will very soon realize that it is not as easy as we thought. We will quickly realize that the people to whom we are witnessing hate God and hate his gospel and are rebellious sinners who every day, just like we once did, raise their fist to heaven and deny the God who makes them, sustains them, and showers them with his grace each and every day. And that realization will very quickly morph into a second. We will be persecuted for our witness. When you hear the gospel and your heart explodes with joy and you go and begin to tell other people about that message, you will very quickly find that they will hate you for it. They will lash out at you. They will try to make your message illegal. They will roll their eyes. They will ostracize you. They will exclude you. They will slander you and the people that you love on social media. They will take you to court. They will assault you, and is so often the case in so many places in the world, even now, they may seek to take your very life. In the words of the text, we will encounter various trials. Literally multicolored trials. This may seem foreign to you in a context where the biggest discussion that we have on a Sunday morning is which car to take. When in reality, the vast majority of Christian history has followed the path not of pleasure, but of persecution. From the very inception of the church, its legacy has been that of martyrdom. To use the words of one preacher, God's truth has sailed down to us on a river of the blood of the martyrs. Christ sends us out as our king, as our shepherd, but he sends us out as sheep amongst wolves. And for those of you who didn't do well in biology, sheep don't do well in the pack of wolves. And now this raises in my mind, and should raise in yours as well, an urgent question. How do we continue to witness, knowing full well that our witness will bring us pain? If it has been promised to us in 2 Timothy 3:12, indeed all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. If that's true, then how can we continue to witness to the world that will bring that persecution to us? How can we embrace suffering for the cause of Christ? And this is the question that I am endeavoring to answer today in this sermon. And I think the exact question that our text, 1 Peter 1, 6, and 7, seeks to answer. This is why I have chosen this text. 1 Peter is a compendium of comfort for suffering saints. 1 Peter has a manifest design, and that design is to encourage suffering saints to continue in their pursuit of godliness in spite of the persecution that will come their way because of that godliness. That godliness will incur grievous trials. And Peter's aim, therefore, is to strengthen the assaulted faith of the persecuted saints so that they will come to serve the Lord in spite of what will happen to them. And Peter's readers have experienced exactly what we talked about last time. They have, in the words of verse 3, 4, and 5, realized that God has had mercy on them, that he has caused them to be born again to a living hope, that through the resurrection of Jesus Christ this has happened, that it is unto an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, and that God's very power guards them in order to keep them through this entire life so that the salvation which is stored up for them in heaven will be there for them when they get there. But Peter recognizes a tension. He says in the beginning of verse 6, "In this you rejoice, in this we should rejoice." But it is not merely joy that is our experience. No, he says, "In this you rejoice, though you have been grieved by various trials." Grieved. Joy and grief. Unlikely partners constantly joined together in Christian experience. We rejoice because of what God has done for us, and we grieve because of what this world does to us. And Peter knows full well that the temptation for these saints, due to these grievous trials, is to shrink back from proclaiming the gospel. And therefore, in the rest of this verse, Peter intends to equip us for the fight to continue to witness in spite of the fact that that witness will even potentially take our very lives. He, as it were, flings the doors of heaven's armory wide open and distributes weapons to us, forged not of steel, but of truth, and bids us use these weapons to fight against the temptation to shrink back from joyfully proclaiming the gospel to the world. And those four weapons are this: hope, perspective, necessity, and they're outlined for you in your worship guide this morning. We'll find the first 3 in verse 6 and the last in verse 7. The first weapon of truth that Peter would have us tuck into our belts is the weapon of hope. If our goal is to fearlessly proclaim the gospel in the face of persecution, then we must go into that battle wielding the weapon of hope. And this is because the text says that the various trials by which we have been grieved happen now. Peter's intention in modifying the word grieved with the word now is to present to us a contrast, a very stark contrast. And what is that contrast? It is between the now and the later. Between the now and the then. Is the contrast between the future and the present, the age of the eternal and the age of the temporal. It is the contrast between the now time and, as he has just said in verse 5, the last time. So when Peter mentions that we are grieved now, it is very important to understand that he is implying that we no longer will grieve then. What is this then? What is this last time? Well, Peter talks about it very much in the book of 1 Peter. He begins in chapter 1, verse 3, talks about a living hope in which we hope. And in verse 4, he calls it an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled and unfading, kept in heaven for you. In verse 5, he calls it the last time. In verse 7, he calls it the revelation of Jesus Christ. If we were to move past this passage, he calls it, in verse 11, the subsequent glories that Jesus Christ entered into. And in verse 13, he would call it the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. If you were to flip over to chapter 2 and look at verse 12, he calls it the day of visitation. Then again, as you near the end of the chapter, he begins meditating on these things again. At the end of the book. In chapter 4, verse 7, he calls it the end of all things. 4:13, that time when his glory is revealed. In chapter 5, verse 4, he goes on to say the unfading crown of glory. Finally, in chapter 5, verse 10, he says that God's work is to restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish us. Why point that out? And the answer is simply to show you this. Peter cannot take his eyes off of heaven. He cannot wait for when Jesus Christ splits the sky and comes back. He cannot wait to see his master, his Lord, his King come to this earth. He cannot take his eyes off heaven. He directs his gaze forward and upward, and as he does, his eyes constantly scan the horizon of this world, looking for that glorious day when all will be made right and God will make all things new. Why? Because he knows that there are no trials in heaven, that we will no longer be grieved in heaven. Tears do not wet our faces there. Graves do not mar the ground. Sin does not pollute our hearts and our bodies and our motives and our minds. Nature does not harm or destroy. Sickness is banished forever. Our perfected bodies no longer feel pain, nor can they die. Wicked men and women will no longer persecute us for the truth that we hold dearly. In other words, the sin which so characterizes this experience is completely absent in that experience. The future holds something for us that is completely different. I can't improve on the words of the scriptures, so listen to Revelation chapter 21. This is where it's all going. Then I saw, says John, a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain, for the former things have passed away. Brothers and sisters, that is ours. That is what awaits us. This is what our very birthright by our second birth is. We own those things. They are completely ours. And therefore, the inheriting of these realities is not put in jeopardy by anything that this world can do for you, do against you. And therefore, what that does is it frees me up from the fear of losing the comforts of this life in order to willingly lay them down at the feet of Christ and say, I will preach your gospel message to this person who will kill me because I want to reach them for you. It makes me able to give up the things that I love so dearly and cling to so tightly in this earth and be able to inherit, therefore, the things of the future. Hope in the future, inheritance, which is heaven, is the blazing torch that dispels the darkness. It is the radiant lighthouse that protects us from danger and guides us home. Hope is the shining North Star that keeps us traveling in the right direction. And the hope of heaven is like the sword that cuts through lies, like this life is all you got, so you might as well make it as pain-free as possible. Or you only live once, that great modern heresy of YOLO. The hope of heaven realizes that these grievous trials are constrained to now, and therefore it frees us to actually live for the future. And therefore, you can look straight in the face of persecution, knowing full well that if I open my mouth and I preach the gospel to this person because of the joy in my heart and my desire to reach them, I will willingly do so even though they will hate me for it. Therefore, let us look beyond the things of this earth to the things of heaven. And let us cast our gaze beyond the horizon of this dark earth and up to the horizon of heaven, where infinite joy awaits us. The second weapon of truth that we must wield against the lies that assault our mind is that of perspective. Perspective. Not only do we need to be armed with hope if we are to fearlessly proclaim the gospel in the face of persecution, we must also arm ourselves with the weapon of perspective. In other words, we need to set this brief, fleeting, momentary nature that persecution brings to us in stark contrast to the eternal, permanent, weighty glories of heaven. We need to put this life in perspective. Why? Because the text says in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6, for a little while. This is intimately related to the point that I just made. In fact, in some ways, it isn't even really all that distinct. But if I were to make a distinction, I would say that hope is what we should have when we look at where we are going, whereas perspective is what we should have when we look at where we are. Hope sets its eyes on heaven and says, that is far better than what I have right now. Perspective sets its eyes on our present circumstances and says, this does not last forever. Often when we go through persecution or pain of any kind, it is very tempting to begin to believe that the suffering will never end. This is the way I feel whenever I catch a cold. It's never going to go away, and if you don't believe me, you can just ask my wife. Why would I willingly undergo persecution if I do not see this life as what it really is, as a fleeting, momentary blip on the screen and it's gone? Trials are like the bubbles in soda that have a lifespan of about 0.5 seconds. They're like the tulips in the spring that seem to blossom one day and wilt the next. They're like the steam of our breath on a cold winter's day when we breathe out and it's there and it's gone. They're like Christmas cookies. They don't last very long. Trials do not last. They are here and then they are gone. It is so important, friends, to realize this. It behooves us to constantly remind ourselves of this when we are thrown in the direct path of savage attacks from this world, from God-hating, gospel-despising people whom we love dearly. When I remember that sufferings are here for a moment, I can willingly embrace them on my mission to reach them with the gospel. And let's not forget that the Bible often thinks this way. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 and 18, one of my favorite passages, says this: "For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look to the things, not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient." That's now. "But the things that are not seen are eternal." That lasts forever. This only lasts for a moment. Psalm 30, verse 5. "For his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry through the night, but joy comes with the morning." Isaiah 54, verse 8. "In overflowing anger, for a moment I hid my face from you, but with everlasting love I will have compassion on you, says Yahweh, your Redeemer." That great passage in Romans chapter 8, verse 18. "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed to us." And later on in this very book of 1 Peter, in chapter 5, verse 10, he will say, "After you have suffered a little while," same word, "the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you." Now, this brief survey is nowhere near exhaustive, but it does communicate to us the point in dramatic relief that sufferings only last for a moment, and that the biblical writers, and therefore we, should set our eyes on the things which are eternal, not the things which are momentary. Several weddings have happened or will soon happen in this church. And as I was thinking about that this week and praying about that, I thought back to my own wedding planning experience, which by all accounts was a very pleasant experience, mostly because my wife is extremely gracious. Wedding planning is a potentially excruciating experience. You have competing visions for the ceremony and the reception. You have family pressures and politics. You need to come up with a guest list and a seating chart. And you need to decide where to get the food and how much to spend on the food. And deal with the pushy people who want to sell you the food. And the wedding planners and the caterers and the venue and. What keeps you going through all that? Is it not the reality that one day I will marry this person? And that all of this, however long you're engaged, is a very brief amount of time compared to the 50 years or so that I will spend with this person. Well, how much is that a comparison to our heavenly marriage with Christ? That through this brief engagement period, we would be willing to put up with things that are unpleasant for the sake of the joy that will one day come to us in heaven. We will be eagerly willing to put up with the, ultimately speaking, minor inconveniences of suffering to enjoy the eternal years of marriage to our heavenly bridegroom. Therefore, let us arm ourselves with the weapon of perspective. The third weapon of truth that we must brandish against the philosophy of this world is that of necessity. Necessity. We are to fearlessly preach the gospel because we realize that persecution that comes because of it has been deemed necessary. This is because the text says that we are grieved if necessary. Now, this phrase can be taken essentially one of two ways. It can mean either if necessary in the sense that we do not seek out trials. We should only endure them if they are necessary, and we should therefore not actively seek out ways to suffer, but we live our lives in light of a watching world and allow the chips to fall where they may. And this is true. It is right, and it is good. But this is not what this text intends to say. This text intends to go further than that and go beyond the fickle nature of human existence up to the very eternal purposes of God. What is intended when Peter says, if necessary, is that God deems persecution necessary for us. He says that it is necessary. God has deemed it necessary. And therefore, when I stare down the person who I want to share the gospel with, who I know will persecute me because of that witness, I can say that whatever comes my way has been deemed necessary by God. Why does he deem it necessary? And the answer is simply this: he intends it for your good. Now we're going to get to that in our final weapon, that of purpose. But suffice it to say for now, that when we say he deems it for our good, he deems it necessary for our good, that good is purification from sin. That good is producing in us a tested, genuine, real faith that can survive through the ages. But before we get there, I just want to consider why that should be an encouragement to you. Why should that be an encouragement to you? Well, if these trials are necessary, then that means that they are under the sovereign control of God. If God deems them necessary, then he is the one who decides their timing, their nature, their contours, their intensity, their details, their purpose, their length. He has said and determined, yes, Justin must go through this trial for his good. He deems it necessary, and therefore he reserves the power to bring it to pass. We must constantly remind ourselves, as that great hymn says, this is my Father's world. Let me ne'er forget that though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. God reigns. He is king, and he does not forfeit that right simply because bad things happen. He is king. He is, as we say in theological terms, if you care, sovereign. Kings are sovereign, and God is king, and therefore God is sovereign. He says, as the scriptures say, that he sits in heaven and he does whatever he pleases. That includes bringing about trials for my good. Secondly, I would say that if trials are necessary, that means that they are limited by the wisdom of God. That God is not an all-powerful, omnipotent despot whom we should fear, but a wise counselor who knows exactly what is good for us. That is to say that the trials which we undergo are never excessive. They are not an ounce more or an ounce less than what you need. They are not any more or any less necessary than what you actually experience. Now that seems to fly in the face of our experience because trials often seem very weighty and very difficult to bear. Trials seem unbearable. And it is at that point of the unbearableness of the trial that we must remember that God is wise and in his wisdom deems this specific trial for me to be necessary for my good. In the words of Paul, no temptation has overtaken you except that which is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted or tested beyond your ability. But with the temptation will also provide the way of escape. The persecutions of this life are not the reckless use of an unwieldy broadsword that you swing without reference to who's around. Rather, they are the precise, deliberate, custom-made incision of a surgeon's scalpel. They are not an atomic bomb that is dropped on your life to destroy indiscriminately, but rather is the cruise missile that hits exactly where it is intended to hit. Lastly, if they are necessary, that means that they are brought about by the love of God. Because God is bringing about these trials in our lives, because it is necessary for us, that means that He loves us. And how easy is it to reason the other way? We often go to the fact that pain and persecution is an expression of God's hatred for us. But that is the exact opposite. We must never conclude that because I am suffering, therefore God does not love me. But rather, we should turn around and acknowledge that it is for the very reason that I am suffering that I can conclude that God loves me. Why? Because it is necessary for my good. And if you don't believe me, just ask yourself one question. Why do you discipline your children? Do you not discipline them for their good because you love them? And do you not realize that the scriptures say this very thing about God Himself? Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 and 6 say, "Have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by Him. Why? For the Lord disciplines the one He loves, and He chastises every person whom He receives." That means that persecutions are tokens of God's love, not His displeasure. I was going to save this to the end, but I want to read you a brief story to illustrate this point. Richard Wurmbrand, who is the founder of Voice of the Martyrs, ministered in the Russian underground church. He himself spent time in the Gulag being tortured with unspeakable tortures, which he details in his book, Tortured for Christ. And in there, he tells many stories of faithful Russian Christians for whom these exact things were true. Listen to the story of one young girl. One of our workers in the underground church, the communist police discovered that she secretly spread gospels and taught children about Christ. They decided to arrest her, but to make the arrest as agonizing and as painful as they could, they decided to delay her arrest a few weeks until the day she was to be married. On her wedding day, the girl was dressed as a bride, the most wondrous, joyful day in a girl's life. Suddenly, the doors burst open and the secret police rushed in. Now, I would stop and ask you, what would you do at this point? Listen to what she did. When the bride saw the secret police, she held out her arms towards them to be handcuffed. They roughly put the manacles on her wrists. She looked towards her beloved and kissed the chains and said, "I thank my heavenly bridegroom for this jewel he has presented to me on my marriage day. I thank him that I am worthy to suffer for him." That's what this text is talking about. To be able to look at shackles at the most painful point in your life, brought about by the sheer evil of men, and to kiss them and call them a jewel from her heavenly bridegroom on her marriage day. We can't do that unless we realize that the trials we go through are necessary. We can't do that unless we realize that God is king and He reigns, and that He sends these things to us purposefully. What's the net effect of this? It means that I may proclaim the gospel knowing full well that I will be persecuted for it, and that I can look down that person and say, whatever happens to me, it is necessary. I trust God that he will only do what is good for me. Now, this is closely tied with our final weapon, which is purpose. The fourth and final weapon of truth, which Peter would have us arm ourselves, is that of purpose. This is because the text contains one of the great so that's. You have been grieved so that the tested genuineness of your faith might be found to result in praise and honor and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. In other words, if we are to continue to fearlessly preach the gospel in the face of persecution, we must acknowledge that all of our suffering has a purpose. So that a deep and abiding purpose. To put it negatively, that is to say, it's not an accident. It is not a mistake. It does not result from random chance, nor from blind fate, nor from unpredictable human choice. It does not, ultimately speaking, result from circumstances by themselves. They are not a fluke, thrown to the wind of fortuitous chance. It's not as though trials happen and God looks down from heaven and says, oops, guess I missed that one. No, he doesn't roll the dice on our lives. He doesn't let random chance take over. No, the text says, so that. We are grieved so that. We are persecuted so that the tested genuineness of our faith may be found to our ultimate salvation. God has a goal which he is pursuing in our suffering. Now, this flies directly in the face of some who call themselves theologians, who in reality are nothing more than purveyors of worldly wisdom. I am thinking particularly of a system of theology that is called open theism. Open theism, which church history knows as Epicureanism, is the idea that God does not know what's going to happen. And this system of philosophy is so uncomfortable with the idea that God could use suffering for his good purposes that they go to the extreme of saying that God didn't know it was going to happen. Therefore, God has no purpose in our suffering. That suffering happens and God throws up his hands and says, sorry, couldn't do anything about that one. Better luck next time. Sure, he cares, he sympathizes, and he grieves and all that stuff, but he never intends. He never has a purpose. But brothers and sisters, this is in direct contradiction to what this text says, which is that we are grieved for a purpose, that our suffering and our trials and our grieving in this life have a point. We must realize that our trials are not the roll of dice, but they are the precise calculations of an omnipotent mathematician who loves us. They are not pickup sticks that fall wherever they may, and we are left to pick them up in however much effectiveness we can, but rather they are a house that is designed and intended for a specific purpose. We must count the cost of our theological commitments. It is true that if it is true that God does not have a purpose in suffering, then verse 7 is not true. If it is true that God has no intention in your persecution, then verse 7 is not true. If there is no intention, then God is not producing in us tested, genuine faith. And if he is not producing in us tested, genuine faith, then he does not deem our faith more precious than gold, which perishes though it is tested by fire. And if he does not deem that faith precious, then we are not guaranteed the praise and honor and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Which again leaves us wondering whether indeed God loves us. As soon as you question whether this verse is true, you throw your faith to the winds of chance. And you put your power on display. And inheriting heaven is no longer based on God's omnipotent promise, but rather based on the roll of the dice or your spiritual muscle. You are either playing spiritual poker or you have entered into a spiritual Mr. Universe contest. But you are not trusting in the sovereign power of an omnipotent God who says he loves you. So what does verse 7 say is the purpose for our suffering? And initially we must say that suffering produces in us the quality of tested, genuine faith. This is a difficult word to translate, tested genuineness, as the ESV has it. The New American Standard Bible translates this word with the word proof. Now, it's not because I'm biased. I did look into it, but I think the ESV does have it here. Tested genuineness. That is, persecution produces a faith that is tested and that is genuine. It is quality and it is real. It is what you do to bite a coin to see whether or not it is made of real gold. In other words, as we suffer for the sake of the gospel, our faith becomes proven. And we suffer in order that this proven faith might be created in us. Now, Peter compares this tested, genuine faith to gold. Peter searches his mind, looking for an illustration to try to help us understand exactly what this looks like, and he arrives at the illustration of gold. Gold is precious. It is intrinsically valuable. It is expensive, and it is worth keeping around. This is why so many people have part of their investment portfolio in gold, because it does not waver in its value. But it is precisely because gold is precious that we refine it. It is precisely because gold is valuable that we purify it of its impurities, so that it might become even more precious and expensive and valuable. As the text says, we test gold by fire. We stick it in a smelting oven, and we superheat it, and we skim away the top so that all that is left over is nothing but pure gold. But that gold perishes. More precious than gold, that perishes, though it is tested by fire. Now, by perishing, it does not mean that it gets destroyed so much as it perishes in the sense that food perishes. It goes bad. It can be used for bad purposes. It can express pride and vanity and selfishness and lust and control and vainglory. It can be used for the glory of man rather than for the glory of God. It can perish. It can be used for purposes for which it was never intended. But just as gold is precious, so is faith. But faith is more precious than gold. In fact, faith is so infinitely more precious than gold that God is willing to go far beyond a simple smelting furnace into the furnace of affliction to purify it. God's aim is to make us unalloyed. He is after a 24-karat kind of faith. He wants us to be pure gold because faith, unlike gold, does not perish. Faith survives. He purifies us not by fire, but by affliction. Listen to the words of Isaiah 48:10. Behold, I have refined you, but not as silver. I have tried you in the furnace of affliction. Speaking of Israel. Now, to this point, you've heard me say that suffering is good. But I don't want you to be confused. Just because suffering is good does not mean it's comfortable. And I should clarify even further by saying when I say that suffering is good, I don't mean that the suffering itself is good, but that what God is intending to accomplish through that suffering is good. Listen to the words of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. It is not comfortable, but it does produce good. Why? Because it leads to eternal salvation. It leads to eternal salvation. As the text has it, this kind of faith may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. What does that mean? Simply this: these grievous trials are producing in you and producing in me the kind of faith that will result in praise and glory and honor. It will result in our salvation. To use the words of Paul once again from Romans 8:17, we are heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided that we suffer with him in order that we may be glorified by him. You may ask, why do we need to suffer with him? And Peter gives the answer. He says, it produces tested, genuine faith. Now, briefly, I want to look at what this leads to, what it results in. It results in praise. This tested, genuine faith results in praise. That is, we will hear those beloved words that Jesus will say to us one day, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master." Praise not in the sense that the Lord will worship us. Rather, we will worship him, but he will praise us in the sense that he will acknowledge the fact that we have done well. It also says that tested, genuine faith results in glory. That is, as Peter will later say in his book, in chapter 5 of this same book, when the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the unfading crown of glory. To use the words of James, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. This tested, genuine faith, lastly, results in honor. In the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians 4:5, when the Lord comes, he will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart, and each one will receive his commendation from God. That is, that in the end, because of this tested, genuine faith, which has come through the persecutions that have been poured out on us because of our witness to a world that hates God, we will be richly rewarded in heaven forever with praise and glory and honor. And all we will do is turn around to give it all right back to him. And what's the net effect of all of this? I would say it's encouragement. Though you may suffer for your Lord is nonetheless working out in you the perfect purposes of his omnipotent will. He is intending in you to produce the kind of faith that will not, cannot, shall not ever fail, and you will inherit the promises that have been given to you. In other words, you can't lose, nor can you be lost. Though you may suffer, God is securing me, he is holding me, and he is keeping me, and he is guarding me. Now, along the lines of the illustration that I gave about the young girl who suffered for the sake of Christ and willingly endured persecution because she loved Jesus and wanted to share the gospel with other people, she was willing to stare down the very trials that she knew would come her way one day. I think it's important for us to take a cue from that. Those of us, namely all of us, who in this country have been stupefied by the rich, luscious wealth of this amazing country that God has created, it's very easy to begin to think that suffering for Christ is not worth it. My friends, it is. Why? Because we have a hope. We have a hope that is far better than what we have now. Because this life only lasts a little while, and we have perspective, and we understand that this life is but a mist that is here and then gone. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. It is because the sufferings that we go through are necessary for us, controlled by God's omnipotent hand, limited by his sovereign wisdom, and motivated by his all-powerful love. And finally, we have purpose. We know that our sufferings are working together in us a salvation that will never fade away. So I'd encourage you to be encouraged by these truths. Think about them. Let them sink in. Let them become to you something that is automatic. You don't even have to think about to jump in and share your faith with someone. And as you do that, people will be saved. And they will give thanks to God. And they will do the same thing. And other people will be saved. And so on and so forth to the end of the age, so that through the salvation of the people of God and their testimony, God might be glorified forever and ever. Let's pray together. Lord Jesus Christ, I pray that you will press home to our hearts these truths and these realities. I pray that we would humble ourselves and recognize that you do, in fact, love us, but you don't always love us in ways that we would want or expect. But this, Lord, only proves to us our lack of wisdom, our lack of knowledge. So teach us, Lord, and empower us, and send us out into this world to proclaim the gospel to a world that is dying, so that you may rescue it, be shown to be the great Savior that you are. In your name we pray. Amen.